Okay, I want you to picture this. It's a hot July morning in 1588, and you're standing outside Greenwich Palace. You can hear the court inside, the rustle of silk. Queen Elizabeth I is holding court. But as you get a little closer, this other smell hits you. It's not perfume. It's sharp, kind of metallic, mixed with this heavy, musky smell of unwashed bodies. That was the real smell of power in Elizabethan England.
Yeah, this was the world of the Virgin Queen, of Gloriana. We all have this image of her, right? Magnificent, covered in jewels, face painted pure white. But underneath that spectacular facade was a reality so foul, it would honestly make you gag. So today, we're pulling back the curtain of perfume and propaganda to get to the really shocking truth of her life.
All right, first up, the royal smell. To even begin to understand why one of England's most famous monarchs lived in what we'd call filth, you have to get your head around her world, a world where taking a bath was seen as genuinely dangerous and where royalty lived in conditions that are, frankly, horrifying to us now.
That's right. For most people back then, from the poorest farmer to the richest lord, taking a full bath was something you'd avoid for months or even years. They had this thing called the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were spread by bad air, and they thought bathing opened up your pores and just let all that sickness right in. So skipping a bath wasn't about being lazy. They thought it was just good, solid medical advice.
So 3. That's how many months Queen Elizabeth would go between taking a bath. And here's the crazy part. For her time, that was considered incredibly hygienic. But even when she did take a bath, the water was pulled straight from the River Thames, which was basically London's open sewer, full of garbage, industrial waste, you name it. And the soap? It was this awful mix of animal fat and ash that would have felt like sandpaper.
So as you can imagine, after 3 months without a proper wash, the Queen's presence was, well, let's just say it was powerful. There's this story from 1579 where the French ambassador's wife actually fainted during a fancy state dinner. Officially, they blamed the heat, but unofficially, everyone knew it was the overwhelming smell coming from the Queen's table. Her body odor was a genuine diplomatic challenge.
Now, this lack of basic hygiene went way beyond just a bad smell. It led to a kind of physical decay that the Queen was absolutely desperate to hide. And it all started from the inside out, with her truly terrible teeth.
Elizabeth had a serious addiction to sugar. You have to understand, in the 16th century, sugar was the ultimate status symbol. It was worth more than gold. It was how you showed off your wealth. So her diet was just loaded with marzipan, candied flowers, and sweet wines. She'd even just snack on sugar crystals. And with literally no dental hygiene, the result was a complete disaster.
And this wasn't some private problem. It became an international spectacle. By her 40s, her teeth were totally black from rot. Foreign diplomats were actually writing these detailed, horrified letters back home about her crumbling smile and her breath, which they said was worse than a tomb.
And what about that iconic red hair? That famous image of her? Well, after she hit her 30s, that was a total fiction too. It was a wig. She wore a whole series of them to hide the fact that her hair was falling out, which was a direct result of the toxic lead-based makeup she was slathering on her skin every single day.
Now, don't picture some fancy, luxurious wig. The hair was bought from peasants, so it probably came in already dirty and full of lice. And she wore these things constantly, right on top of open, weeping sores on her scalp caused by the lead poisoning. It was a perfect breeding ground for infection and parasites. They were never washed, just covered in more powder, trapping all the sweat and filth and creating the signature stench that people at court learned to recognize.
So this is where the poisoning came from. To get that famously pale look, Elizabeth used a makeup called Venetian ceruse. It sounds elegant, but it was a toxic paste of white lead and vinegar. Every single day, she would plaster the stuff onto her face and wear it until it cracked. Then, to get it off, she had to literally scrape the hardened mask away, which would often rip off strips of her own skin. And the next morning, she'd just apply a fresh layer of poison right on top of the raw, bleeding surface.
This bizarre mix of splendor and total squalor went beyond just her body. Her whole world was basically a monument to magnificent filth, from her priceless dresses to her private bedroom.
Just look at that number, over 3,000 gowns. And these weren't just clothes, they were masterpieces, made from the finest silks and velvets you can imagine, and just dripping with pearls and gems. A single one of these dresses was worth more than an ordinary person would earn in their entire life.
But here's the catch. Because they were so incredibly delicate, you could never, ever actually wash them. So instead, they were just aired out,
maybe brushed off, and then sprayed with more perfume. Which means that every single gorgeous gown she owned was basically a sponge, soaking up years of sweat, body oils, and who knows what else, all trapped deep inside the fabric. Of course, she tried to cover all this up. She loved perfume, especially one made from civet musk, which, just so you know, comes from the anal glands of a cat. But you know what happens when you spray heavy perfume on top of a bad smell, right? It doesn't really cover it. It just mixes with it. It creates this whole new, overpowering smell. And that quote says it all. One courtier described it as a rose garden built over a sewer. And nowhere was that stench worse than in her own bedroom. The royal bedsheets were changed maybe once a month. Maybe. They were said to be stiff and yellow with sweat. Servants who had to go in there in the morning said the air was so thick with the smell of an unwashed body and stale perfume that they literally had to fight not to throw up.
So as Elizabeth got older, a whole lifetime of this stuff, the bad hygiene, the sugary diet, the literal poisoning, it all started to catch up with her in a big way. That perfect, glorious image she had built so carefully was starting to crack, and the decay underneath was becoming impossible to hide. I mean, you can just trace the decline. In her 30s, her hair falls out because of the lead. In her 40s, her teeth are destroyed by the sugar. By the time she's in her 60s, that chronic lead poisoning was almost certainly affecting her mind. We're talking memory loss, paranoia, and just wild mood swings.
Towards the end, the woman under all the paint and powder was just a wreck. Her skin was a mess of lesions and scars that no amount of makeup could cover anymore. She could barely eat solid food, and her mind was so clouded by the toxins that her behavior became more and more bizarre.
And the smell, it reached a whole new level. The combination of everything, unwashed skin, infected sores, the rotting teeth, the stale perfume, it created an aura so bad that courtiers had a blunt name for it: the smell of death. You could apparently smell her coming from several rooms away, and some servants would actually run and hide to avoid getting too close.
When Elizabeth finally died in 1603, all the fictions she'd maintained just fell apart. The people who prepared her body for burial saw the true horror of the decay she'd been hiding. And that signature smell of hers, it lingered in her apartments for months after she was gone, so powerfully that they had to seal off parts of the palace.
So it leaves you with this really haunting thought, doesn't it? Here's a woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, who ruled with an iron will for 45 years. But in the end, maybe her greatest enemy wasn't Spain or some foreign power. Maybe her greatest enemy was her own reflection and the impossible, poisonous price she paid to maintain her image. The woman who claimed she was married to England died married only to her own decay.